Hello everyone, I'm back with another official video. This one's going to be a bit different because I've been getting super boinged out lately on a hobby that I've loved since early childhood, which is miniature wargaming. I'll explain the story behind that in another video, but for now I'm going to quickly talk about something related to the painting of miniatures. Later this month, I'm going to be teaching a free class on the basics of beginner miniature painting for some friends, and I wanted to communicate some information to them about some of the more technical knowledge pertaining to paints and brushes and stuff like that. I wrote a big, massive email and then realized that email was going to explode their heads, so instead, I decided to kill two birds with one stone. Film some long overdue videos, but also use them as a way to catch up the students before we begin our class. So this is my attempt to make a series of very short, easy to follow videos that you can pretty much use to get started without getting too overwhelmed. So here's my disclaimer though. There are plenty of way more amazing miniature wargaming folks out there who have already covered this in much better ways on YouTube, and I'm going to link to them below. Because I love this hobby and I love what they are doing, I want to highlight them, but all credit really does go to them because they are my YouTube video gurus. Whatever I'm showing you, I learned from them. So first steps to getting ready for painting. What is your palette going to be? A palette is where your paint lives while you're painting a project, so you have easy access to it. This means you won't have to keep popping open your paints every time you need a color, and it's going to keep them fresh. So ideally, you will want a wet palette. A wet palette is best for acrylic paints, which is what we are using for our class, because they are water-based and they'll retain their moisture and not dry out if they're being kept moist by something, i.e. your wet palette. So step one is grab a plate. You're grabbing a plate because I'm telling you to, but really anything that is ceramic, glass, or plastic should work. It just needs a reservoir or a shape to hold water. Step two, grab a paper towel or two and fold it to the size of your plate. And then get your paper towel very wet and then carefully squeeze it out while retaining some of the wetness as some kind of painter's Fremen-esque reserve. Bless the maker and his water. Step 3. Grab some baking parchment. This is known by a few names, but basically any baking paper, baking parchment, or cooking parchment should be fine as long as it is porous and non-wax. You want something that will allow the water of your palette to flow easily between the wet paper towel and the paint you put on the paper. Before you can use it, cut it to a size that fits the paper towel, i.e. try not to cut it larger than the paper towel, but not so small that you can't fit any paint on it. Okay, wait, you say. I don't have baking parchment, and what's more, I'm too lazy to go out and buy some, or I just don't have time. Don't worry, I'll get to that later, but for now, follow along and I'll address that issue. Step 4. Take your wet paper towel and place it on your custom homemade palette. Step 5. Take your porous baking parchment and place it over the wet towel. Flatten it down with your hand, dab it, and generally make sure it's adhering to the wet towel. It may want to curl, but don't be alarmed. This is normal and annoying. Simply let it get wet and settle with some more flattening and dabbing. Or flip it over and use the other side if that seems to work better. Now you're getting ready for paint. Get a brush, like a standard work brush. Get a smallish dollop of paint on your brush and place it down on the palette. As this dollop settles onto the palette, it will absorb water through the paper and water itself down, which is very good because you want to water your paints down so they get that nice, flowy, and smoothie feeling for painting. Get your brush sorted by getting rid of excess by giving some practice strokes on the palette, and then you're ready to go. I'll explain in another video how to care for your brushes while painting before and after, but for now this is all about the palette. With this palette you should be good to paint for a while, and you should feel safe leaving your paints out in the open. If you notice that things are way too runny and watery, you've probably added too much water to the palette, but don't fret. Just drain it out or dab up the excess moisture with a sponge or a paper towel. If the paint seems a little too thick and isn't flowing smoothly, then you don't have enough water. Using a cup, simply pour out water into the reserve in small increments. Wait between pours and just see what happens. Sometimes you're going to have to finagle it, but that's okay. Every palette's going to be different because of its size. So, for those that don't have baking parchment, this part's kind of a little bit raw and dirty. Basically, just use your paper towel as the palette. Squeeze it out to the point where it's retaining enough moisture without absorbing up the paint and vice versa. If that still doesn't feel like it's working, you can take a regular old plate and just use that as your palette and just make sure that you're watering your paints down with your brush. Okay, if you've got this far, you have everything you need to know when it comes to making a cheap and frankly very usable palette. I've been using this sort of technique for a very long time. In fact, probably a couple years before I even bought my own quote-unquote professional wet palette. However, if you want some more nerdy details and tricks of the trade, stick around. Okay, imagine we're going to do the same thing that I just described, but you want to be able to save your palette and use it the next day, or you just want to set it aside for a few hours without it going dry. Then Tupperware is your best friend. Grab a Tupperware container, something like sandwich size, and make sure you have a top for it. When you're all done painting, simply pop the top on, put it in the fridge, and come back to it. The key here is to come back to it. Don't come back weeks later. It will be bad and will then require you to survive the night in your home, trying to figure out what person in your family the organism has consumed and impersonated so that they can fix their crashed spaceship. Once you're ready to paint again, simply pull out the palette, pop off the top, and start painting. Now, if for some reason your paints feel dry or were spread too thin on the palette and don't seem as moist, just hit them with a little bit of water via your brush and it should liven things up enough to be able to use them again. I find that sometimes I've just spread the paint too thin as I'm using it, and it just does require a little bit of water, but that doesn't mean that your palette is broken. It just simply means the paint is too thin on the palette. Okay, that's it. As always, you can find me online at twitch.tv/Casadari, and you can find me on socials at Casadari Games. If you have a question or comment, leave it below in the comment section, and I will respond as fast as I can. Happy gaming and happy painting. More to come.